Welcome to another episode of Lead Me, where we want to help you take the next step in leadership. Today, Pastor Eric and Zach are discussing the daily grind of leadership. They're taking a closer look at the reality of the daily grind so that we can take ground in our leadership.
So last year, I had the pleasure of attending the Global Leadership Summit held at one of our locations here, one of our local areas. And it was a really great opportunity to really showcase or at least learn from, leaders within their fields. And I found that I've learned a lot of information through the Global Leadership Summit. And one of the speakers that they actually had last year, his name is Rich Wilkerson Jr. He's actually the co-founder of, it's called Phelps Leader Conferences, also a church as well. But he's one of the larger pastors out there. But he had a really good talk about the grind and how we could look at the grind and how we could reframe the grind, and really what are some of the challenges with the grind, or what are some of the roadblocks that we hit when we hit this term that we call the grind.
Yeah. So kind of speaking, that as you're talking about the grind, I'm assuming that means that it's that difficult part of leadership that, you feel like you're kind of at a stall or like in a waiting pattern, or it's just things are moving slowly, even as a leader. And sometimes for us as leaders, that can be really frustrating, right? So I'm sure that's what the grind is. Is that a good summary of that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a really good summary of what the grind is. And a really good picture of it is, if you picture yourself, sometime in the past, right, where you've gotten really excited about, let's say, basketball, right? You join the team, you're excited, you have a vision of where you see yourself, and then you hit that first practice, and the coach,
I'm going to score 30 points.
Right, exactly. And then the coach, tells you to, run a couple laps, and you start to realize the work that kind of goes into that. And I played basketball once or twice before on a team, and you could tell the energy level kind of wane when you start doing those drills, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, as you kind of persevere through those drills, that's what makes you a better, basketball player in this case.
Yeah, and that's what I thought about when you say perseverance. That's kind of what we want to capture with the grind is understanding that there is that hard, difficult part. And I think that's what he kind of described, right? The reality of the grind.
Right.
And so what were some of the bullet points from that?
Yeah. So really, one of the big points in the reality of the grind is that, and I'm going to refer to my notes here, but a lot of leaders really aren't lost in the epic battle. We have that one main goal that we see. A lot of times we're not lost in that. A lot of times you see leaders being lost in the grind or the aspect. So one of the examples here lately is with COVID, right? So, we've had leaders have the goals that we've set, for organizations or for churches or whatever the teams may be. But then all of a sudden COVID came, complete game changer. And for a lot of times now for me, it was a grind because I worked from home, and, it's very monotonous, very low key. You felt like traction wasn't being had, or you couldn't see any discernible traction. So, but and it's easy.
And another thing I think about with that, like you mentioned, it's not that you lost the future. You see the vision. You see, you know where you want to go at times as a leader. But the grind is this part where the reality sets in. It's going to take a while to get there sometimes. It's going to be a difficult track. It's going to be or you hit that, like you're saying with COVID, it's
Right.
just like everything stood still for a while in some ways. And so like that momentum, you lose that energy and that excitement over a course of period of time where you have to find it within yourself to kind of say, okay, I need to regroup and kind of
Right.
move forward. Right.
Right. And that was one thing that I've been kind of going through here recently. I decided like I'm going to start running like first thing in the morning. And, the first, 5 days, it's exciting, right? It's like, I'm moving, I feel good. But then it kind of sets in, starts like normalize. And then you do have those mornings where you do question like, well, why am I putting myself through this?
Yeah.
And, that's going to be the time where you really want to rely on, your why. Like, why exactly are you doing this to begin with? And I think that's what Rich Wilkerson really brought with his message was not only like looking at the why, but really reframing why you're going through the grind. And it's like also with Christians as well, sometimes life does feel like a grind, I think Paul talked about running a race, and it's a marathon, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not a quick sprint. It's a full on race. It's a, like you said, marathon. I think that's interesting too. Like, the idea that a lot of times we feel overwhelmed by that. Like, I think sometimes we can feel lost, right? Like we see this future and it can be like this vision that we have of where we want to be. But like, it's not only sometimes of the pushing through, but even what step is next, right? That sometimes makes it hard because, we want that end game, right? So we kind of, and sometimes we may take those little fundamental things for granted, like you're saying about running,
Well, I think too is with our, I feel like with our culture as well, we really, I want to say like idolize the end product. So, we look at sports figures. So we have, like professionals in the fields, but we see them at like the pinnacle of their career. We just have the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
We look at them and like, I wanted to go down.
We haven't watched all the footage of their training day after day.
Right, exactly. And so we idolize where they are now and we see their successes. But if we really realize, or if we kind of took a moment to step back and like look at what that work entailed to get them to that point. I mean, it's like an iceberg, right? An iceberg, there's only, like a certain amount of percentage, a small fraction of the iceberg, like sticking out in the water, but like the majority of the iceberg is under the water. That's the same thing I feel like with this. And that portion that's under the water is where the grind is. It's that day in and day out, that repetition.
It's the unseen things. Like what he even talks about, I think, right? Is this right? I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but a lot of the things that you're doing with the grind is going to be unseen. You're not going to get a thank you. You're not going to get compliments. These are the things that part of the grind is that you're not going to be told great job or things always, but those are the things that are unseen that you're doing behind the scenes that are really crucial for us to have that end result.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, that's really, he talks about the reality of the grind. We've really talked about that and, how it's easy to kind of get lost and get like unmotivated, especially, I mean, if you're the personality type where you do want approbation or, you want that instant gratification of saying, hey, I did this now, like where's the like thank you or the where's the gratitude you know and as human beings I feel like we want to hear that, but if we don't hear that, it's like, are you still going to keep going on? Because if you don't, that's like, well, what's your motivation? Is it really that strong?
So I think some of the things he provides is really helpful. Do we want to cover the next one?
Absolutely. So I'll just kind of give a quick overview. So he does really give like 3 primary things to really approach the grind. And the 3 primary things that we'll cover is renaming the grind, reframing the grind, and remaining in the grind. So Eric will just kind of step through each one of the steps, and we'll take it one at a time and kind of go through that and kind of see what we learn, figure out from that process.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So the first one is renaming the grind. So, according to Rich, right, and according to like the information that he provided, he said really the first step is to really like bring about like an identity. So he kind of talked about names,
Yeah.
and we name a lot of items in our lives, whether that's like actual tangible items or events in our lives, and we could either give it like a positive name or a negative name, right?
Yeah, I really like that idea, that concept of,
Yeah.
are we going to say something, create something positive, or creating something negative? Because
Right.
those negative connotations pretty much stay negative.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing too. It's like when you encounter a challenge, right? So it's like we'll take our basketball analogy there. So when you hit practice, like, do you call it, oh man, like this is horrible, like practice, like this is bad, or do you name it as this is the way I'm going to get better?
Yeah.
So I mean, just between those two, it's like, oh, this is something I have to do versus something I get to do. So that's going to be another way of like renaming the grind.
like thinking of it as an opportunity and actually naming
Right.
that as an opportunity, rather than, this is, boring, or this is lackluster. A lot of times we can think of certain things and we kind of, name it a certain thing that's negative, and changing that name kind of helps us reshape it to be a more positive thing for us.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've really worked hard, and it's still a work in progress, but I call it a term called like higher quality problems.
Yes.
So that has been huge and in my life. And this is something that I've started about like 2-3 years ago. And I've seen a huge difference in it because, ultimately as human beings, we want the challenge, right? We want the challenge, whether we like it or not. We like the challenge. And when challenges kind of slack off, when we find ourselves in a plateau, we get bored. And that's usually when we get into trouble, right?
Yeah.
Or we start questioning our lives, or we get dissatisfied with our lives. So as human beings, we actually like problems. Sometimes we just don't like how it's packaged, or that it forces us out of our comfort zone. So that's one of the things is like, all right, so if I start out each day asking for higher quality problems, I'm already asking for it. So I'm already positioning myself to receive those problems. And because I know that through the resolution of those, I grow in my skill level, my personal life, and as my character grows, and I get to learn more about myself, and I get to push myself a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things I thought was kind of funny when he mentioned this in your notes that I looked at, it was he called something boring, call it research and development.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Like these daunting tasks or these things, maybe some of us don't like to investigate too many things.
Right.
I like that term, research and development, because it's more of a positive spin on certain things. And so if we can look at those things that are seeming like tedious or negative or hard, and try to reshape the naming of that,
Right.
it really puts us in a different perspective. And I know, like Ken Blanchard talks about personal vision and creating a personal vision. What are some of the words that could describe you? What are some nouns? What are some verbs? And I think that's true too. Like if you can kind of use some words that are positive to kind of motivate you to kind of have an end game of what you want people to say about you, what you kind of want to represent in your life, that can help you to kind of be focused on those areas. And I think with the negativity, it causes us to be powerless in some ways when we are so negative, because we feel overwhelmed.
Right.
But when we can reshape the naming of that, it's like we're giving power to say, no, I'm going to change this.
Right.
I'm going to take some aggressive behavior in the sense to say, I'm not going to let this reshape me. I'm going to reshape it in some way.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of taking the fear and the scariness of it, or the monotony of it, away from that.
Well, the thing too is when you put yourself in a position where you do take responsibility for your situation, I think that plays a key role in your ability, or what you think is your ability to change the circumstance that you're in. Because, many times I've found myself in that situation before where you live in this reactionary mindset, and, you feel like the world is happening to you rather than you're making an impact on the world. And so when you live in that reactionary mindset, you're always reacting to whoever. So, whether you're driving down the road and, someone cuts in front of you, you're reacting because of what that person did. And when you're proactive and you make impact on the world, you make that decision to say, hey, I know this is going to come up, but I have a choice in that moment. And that choice is, how do I react in this? Like, do I say a prayer for them? Maybe they're on their way to the hospital, and it may not necessarily be the case, but hey, it makes you feel better. And you've made that choice to be positive in that moment.
And we see examples of this in the as far as companies and even our organizations like the church, where, like our church, we don't call board meetings because it's got that idea of what's a boring meeting. Well, we call them business meetings because it's, so even like little subtle things, or we don't call it a complaint hotline. We call it customer service, right? So it's like words like that can reshape and redefine what that is to give a more positive spin on something that may be difficult or hard. You don't want to communicate that. So even in our own life with the grind, it's if we can kind of reshape that in some way to rename it can.
Well, you mentioned research and development, and I think that's really important because I kind of think of research and development as really like playing around. I mean, you kind of have a problem, but a lot of times you're experimenting, right? So you're trying to find the next best thing. You may not know what that next best thing is. So you may go through like different iterations of what that product could be, right? So what you start off with may not necessarily be what you end up with. And so, you kind of see this with like when companies create cars, right? The first concept may not necessarily be what the end product is, but they have to go through this journey of trying to figure out what worked and what didn't. And that's really the grind because it gets monotonous. But I think it's really important when we see the grind, and Rich really alluded to this, like when you're in the grind, a lot of times that's your higher quality problem because you're in the grind. And so you start questioning your why. Well, maybe that is the problem, is say, like, is my motivation there? Like, and so a lot of times going through the grind and trying to determine what the higher quality problem is, you usually come away with a much better solution, or a solution that you never would have figured out in the first place or encountered in the first place if you hadn't gone through that process.
Yeah, and another thing to add to this too is that a lot of times when I think you're alluding to it, was if you have an idea or if you have a vision, that it may not be that at the end, but that's okay. Right. It's okay. Maybe going through the grind, it'll get better. It'll be a better idea.
Right.
And I think one of the things that I took offense to a lot of times when I shared an idea, and if it wasn't fully accepted, I felt like somehow that was attached to me. And I think one of the things that would help us, talking about the grind, is make sure your idea or your vision is not attached to you.
Right.
Let it live on its own, because if it's a good idea or if it's a great vision, then it's gonna build itself.
Right.
Like you need to be sharing it and taking care of it, but you don't need to be attached to it physically to say if it's turned down or if it's done something, it's on me. You know? Try to separate yourself from your idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, while I think a lot of times we kind of we take ownership of that because we put so much, I feel like, of who we are in that product, that when it is critiqued, we take that offense as like a critique to us. But I think also that's where we talked about reframing or renaming.
Let's go ahead and talk about that, because I think that would be good to
absolutely.
move on to that.
But reframing that grind, it's like reframing that question. Is it a critique on me? But if it is a critique on you, right? Are you going to use that for the positive? Like, are you going to separate yourself from yourself? And I think it's also the other thing too, because I think that's why we're we don't take feedback as well, I feel like. And it's because we take it personally instead of seeing the motivation behind that critique.
So. And oftentimes, at least for me, in my experiences, it's that I'm taking offense unfairly, to that feedback, because maybe the idea just needs refined. Maybe the feedback is going to make that idea better or that vision better. So when you're going through that grind and you feel like you're stalling or you feel like you're hitting some walls there, don't allow that to feel like that, this is going to end badly or it's terrible. Going back to taking a personal offense to it, maybe it needs to withstand that and go through that. And like we're talking about reframing, I think that's one of the biggest challenges I think most leaders have, is that if they don't hit that perfect vision, then they feel like, it's not going to happen.
Right.
Or even if they don't get close enough to where they think they should be. I think reframing, and correct me if I'm wrong, from what I understood, was it's about looking at a problem in different ways and maybe taking it more of a bite-sized approach,
right,
to where you can accomplish some goals and maybe not catch everything. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've heard this this metaphor analogy before, but it's when you set your vision, you want to be able to look through like a telescope, right? So you're looking through a telescope and you see where you want to go. So whatever, like a monument, or you're walking and you pull out your binoculars and you look out like 2-3 miles. But then once you're done, you don't walk the entire distance using your binoculars, right? At some point you have to put them down and you have to look at the steps in front of you, whether it's stairs or the obstacles. But then from time to time, to encourage you, you look up, you use your binoculars, and you see where you're going. So it's like this dance between knowing what your vision is down the road and looking at what's immediately in front of you and taking those steps to get you to that goal.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're doing construction. You got to look at the plans every once in a while.
Absolutely, yeah.
But you still have to go out there on the field and start building, right? So
right.
You can go back and look at the plans, but still you have to go and do the work to get to that vision.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and I think that reframing it. I think it's also looking at it like, I guess, looking at building, or like you even said, the telescope, or not telescope, you said
binoculars. Right.
Looking at that, you can have success with these other parts that you do if you make it in smaller steps, and accomplish those steps, and that can kind of give you the fuel to go to the next step.
Right.
I think you mentioned about like 20%, like if you can solve for 20% of the problem, then it makes the 80% so much easier.
So this is something that I learned from one of the classes that I took, but they said that most of the time when you take a look at a process, 80% of your problems lie within 20% of your process.
Wow.
So the big item is to really ask yourself, they have this thing called 5 whys. So you have a problem. So you state that problem, and then you go into 5 levels of whys. So I don't like getting up this morning. Well, why do I not like getting up this morning? And then you answer that question, and then you ask yourself, then why am I doing this? And what you're trying to do is you're trying to break down that big problem. And a lot of times we'll find out that when we asking the 5 whys gets you down to the root of the problem, and the root of problem is, if you solve that solves the majority of your issues. But it's not easy by any means. It requires a lot of introspection, a lot of questioning. But if you're like truthful yourself, you'll be able to get to the root of the problem, And if you solve that small thing, a lot of times it's like a small change, and that small change causes big.
Yeah, sometimes the things that get me excited in leadership, and especially when I'm experiencing the grind where it's just getting that monotonous, is that little tiny victories, or those little tiny moments that give me hope. It gives me a spark to say, okay, well, maybe this will, just like you're saying, and you kind of feel, if you can hit some of those, then it kind of builds a momentum for the next set of problems that you may face.
Well, and they said, Michael Phelps. Michael Phelps, was a really acclaimed swimmer, very accomplished, and he started his days off with a win. So like we see the final product of him winning a gold medal, right? But he started the morning off with small wins, and that progressively, like, I checked this off and I checked this off. And so that kind of led and built to what we saw, on television. So, I mean, that kind of leads back to that. The other thing, too, as well as with reframing the grind, and I'm going to read this because it's quoted from Rich, but
Sure.
he says, "We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are." And really, the idea is that we have this really poisoned perspective, and that prevents progress because and there's another thing that he mentions that throughout a day, we think about like an average of 40,000 thoughts. Whether that's, we actually think about it and we make the choice, or it's subconscious. It's that repetition that we tell ourselves, right? Whether it's like, I'm going to do this, I want to have coffee, or, I'm not good enough, or like you did a task and you're like, I don't think I did a good job. Well, that necessarily makes me a bad worker, so it really leads you down that path. And so out of 40,000 thoughts, the vast majority of them are negative thoughts.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a really interesting statistic.
Yeah.
But I like that this quote that says we don't see things as they are, and
a lot of times what's inside of us is projected onto that vision or that idea or product that we create. And, we got to separate again that and try to, like we're saying, reframe it, right? Reframe it to where it has a different approach.
Yeah. Or like perspective, sometimes we're so comfortable with the perspective that we have that we don't necessarily just question to say, hey, like, let me talk to someone else and see what their perspective is on this. Because, like my, one of the things that I've talked about before was like a cylinder, right? If you rotate a cylinder, depending on where you are, you either see the silhouette of a circle or of the cylinder itself. And so that's really the powerful thing about perspective and being in the grind and reframing it, because you might just see another side to the grind.
Well, that's a good example. I also want you to share about the silver medal syndrome, because I think that was a real key there, unless you wanted to share something. I will say about Instagram, I do think that a lot of times, with our culture, we kind of get this idea that everything has to be perfect. And I think that really stops us. I think we've talked a little bit about that, about the idea, but, sometimes things happen in a mess, like there needs to, of course there needs to be some control and there needs to be some guidance, but if we go to this idea that everything has to be perfect, a lot of things wouldn't be done. I think about Thomas Edison, like he didn't, every time he didn't create a light bulb, he thought, well, that's just not how you make a light bulb. It wasn't like total failure, even though it took him 100 times to create a light bulb. He saw it as an opportunity to know, okay, these are not the elements that you put together to create a light bulb. So I think that's a lot of times our problems. Like we want this picturesque, perfect scenarios, and that's not going to lead to success. And like all the examples you've shared, whether it's Michael Phelps or other people, it's just not going to happen if you keep that mindset. You're going to be frustrated and you're going to be disappointed.
Well, and that's a really good point too, Eric, because. And I'll kind of take this. It kind of it really ties in with this, but diamonds, right? So take one of the shiniest things out there, right? A top price for the final product, right? But if you kind of look back at the process that it came through, like if you look at the first example of like that diamond out of nature, I mean, sure, you may find some shiny parts of it, but it's not like the perfect faceted diamonds that we see, right? So you take those diamonds and you have to go through the grind, right? You have to grind those surfaces into those perfect facets. That way it catches the light, it glints, it's perfect, and then it's sold. But there's that process, and literally it's ground down to perfection, basically.
Not even speaking of the time it creates, it takes to create a diamond.
Exactly. And it's straight under pressure, and I mean, it's huge pressure.
Yeah.
The pressure to like turn carbon into,
this beautiful thing.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's the thing when we find ourselves in times of pressure, in times of grinding. I mean, even the Bible kind of talks about it, right? And, the verse eludes me, but with gold, it's smelted, right? So that the dross, rises to the top.
Take out the other elements that were in the gold.
Right, absolutely. And so that's part of like reframing. It's like, gosh, this is a really tough situation that I'm going through, but know that you're not alone. You know, you have God. You know,
even asking definitely have God, and then also asking, what can I learn from this? Maybe there's some things in that grind that you're learning through that process. Developing good habits, like you talked about, like getting the right mindset in that process. So I think that's very important.
And that was one of the things that. One of the things just from reframing the grind, but one of the items that he brought, he said that everything you are facing in this season is preparing you for the next season.
Yeah.
So rename it and call it preparation. So, I mean, that's huge. Like, gosh, this is a really boring time, but it's preparation. You know, like if I do this well, it'll prepare me for when that opportunity comes. And then you're able to take full advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah.
So.
Actually, speaking of that, there was a time where I felt God called me to a certain church to become a youth pastor, but they already had somebody leading the youth. Right. And I felt like for over a period of 6 months, I was helping out a little bit, but it wasn't the call, Right. I was wanting to be in charge. And it was interesting because about the time I was about ready to say, God, I think I'm just going to check out some other churches and go leave, God opened the door. And I think that there's so many times where we kind of miss those opportunities. I think it goes along with staying in the grind, though. But I want you to make sure you share that silver medal thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, and Rich kind of talked about the silver medal syndrome, and I never really thought about it in that way. But he talked about how the silver medalists statistically are the most unhappy with what they received, like the reward they received, because they're in this position to where, maybe they missed reaching the gold medal position based off of like 100th of a second or a 1,000th of a second. So there's always that thing in the back of their mind where they're thinking, gosh, if I just pushed maybe just a little bit, I could have got that. But when you look at the bronze medalists, they're more happy because, just a fraction of a second out and they wouldn't have had anything. Yeah, exactly. And so it's like that perspective of, treating everything like it was something that you potentially could not have had,
Yeah, and I think that again, it goes back to the fact that are we so concerned about being number one, or are we more concerned about just making a difference with what we're doing? It goes back to the vision, the purpose. I don't think that, we know in life that not everybody's going to win first place on everything, but does that mean everything else has less value? Like it doesn't. Like the things you do, as far as I know, like these companies that are out there in the world, they may not necessarily care if they're number one or number two. If they're still making money and they're making a profit, maybe they're better off not being like the biggest company in the world. Like what is it? Apple's like the most, or Microsoft.
One of those.
But why does it matter? Right. You know what I mean? Like as long as you're doing a niche and you're serving an area of need. But a lot of times, like you said, I think about that too with the silver medal, that it's almost like we question, like, could I have done this? Could I have done that? And with the bronze, it's like we're just excited to be there.
Right. Well, I think that really kind of takes us to our third point, which is remaining in the grind, because really our purpose, what our purpose is, or what our why is, like what our end goal kind of determines why we remain in that grind. Because as you said, like, if you compare like a sprinter, we'll just take a sports analogy. You have a sprinter versus a marathon runner, right? Yeah. A sprinter won't be able, sure, they'll beat the marathon runner for the first 100 meters, right? And they'll do it in like really good fashion. But the marathon person will run 26, you have ultra marathon individuals that run, hundreds of miles, 100 miles.
Yeah.
And
they're more at a consistent rate because they've trained their bodies to be at that consistent rate, where the sprinter is just giving it all they can at that, burst.
Yeah, exactly. So knowing your purpose really kind of defines how you handle stuff, because, and that really kind of brings into like comparison. You talked about Instagram and like comparing people. It's like, well, this person's life looks so much better, but what was their what's the purpose that they have in mind? Maybe you have a different path that you're taking, and that's why different things look different. And of course, with Instagram, social media,
Yeah.
we only share the good things.
Exactly.
We don't really share the bad things that we experience. We don't share that stuff, and so we're only sharing the good stuff. And if we're in a season where we're not seeing the same sort of good things happening to us, then we start comparing. Well,
Yeah.
we may have good things down the road, and that same person may not. So, and it could be in different areas. Like they could be doing good, really well financially, but also be hurting relationally as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of considerations to take in mind.
Well, as you share that, I think you're going back to your race analogy, that when you're looking backwards, you're slowing down.
Right.
The people that are racing the race that keep their head forward, they're going to run faster.
Right.
If anybody looks back, you're ultimately slowing yourself down,
Right.
because you're not looking towards the goal.
Yeah.
You're not pursuing the goal that you're after to finish the race.
Well, I think the thing too is being happy, being content, right? And I think knowing that you gave 100%, 110% of what you're capable of, so like in your analogy, like as a sprinter, you're running down the track and you have your eyes on the goal. Well, if someone who also has their eyes on the goal, beats you, gosh, like that's awesome,
Yeah.
like being happy in that person's accomplishment. Achievement, yeah, absolutely. Helps with that grind, because it's not a zero-sum game. There's always going to be areas where you may give 110%, but that you may give it all you got, but you may not necessarily reach a certain goal that you've set.
Yeah.
But it's the idea of going through the grind and developing your character in the process.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's a very important thing, developing your character in the process, because, as we know, I can't remember where exactly it is off the top of my head, but perseverance builds, trials builds perseverance, perseverance builds character, and then with character, you build hope.
Right.
And so, going through those stages is really kind of remaining in the grind, if we remain in the grind, it's going to develop us over time.
Right.
Like I mentioned about waiting for that youth ministry position. During that time, it was aligning my heart and helping me develop some ideas, so that when I had the opportunity, I was ready to go. I already had lessons prepared. I already had ideas to go with. And sometimes in the grind, you may feel like you're stalling, but that's a time for you to kind of reimagine and reframe, but also to refine some of the things that you want to do, when you get there, when you have your opportunity.
Yeah. And I mean, and the thing too is a really important part, and I think that's important about like remaining in the grind, is just knowing what's going to happen. So, and I think a lot of times we're always looking for the quick hit, like as far as, I just want the answer. I want the shortcut to X, whatever it may be. And a lot of times we just have to tell ourselves, I'm going to get into the situation where it's going to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I know it's going to be uncomfortable. So when you hit it, you don't ask yourself like, this is so unfair because I'm experiencing discomfort.
Yeah.
You're already proactively thinking about that. And when you hit that discomfort, that's you being thrown out of your comfort zone. You're being pushed, and you just have to kind of keep going,
Yeah.
And by doing that, I feel like so many times we go through and we like talk ourselves out of not sticking to the grind. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, you quit. But if you just given just a little bit more effort, you would have gone there.
Yeah, that leads me to one of my favorite verses, Galatians 6:9, where it talks about, do not become weary in doing good, because at the proper time you receive a harvest if you don't give up. And I think that what you just said there is that part where how many times have we missed the harvest because we just gave up on an idea? we gave up on an opportunity. We decided to not stay in the grind and remain there because we just wanted to quit.
Right.
And I think that, I use this probably a lot with my sermon illustrations, but the moth, little boy had a moth, and so he was like, it was struggling because it was in the larvae state and it's trying to become this moth, and when it tries to break out, well, he feels sorry for the moth, so he tries to cut a little sliver in the cocoon to give it that space. Well, what he didn't realize is that fluid that was in his wings was supposed to go down to his body, and he couldn't fly. The moth couldn't fly because there was too much fluid in his wings, because he didn't go through the process of the grind in the cocoon to force that fluid into his body. Yeah. And so, a lot of times we think as the grind as a really bad thing, or that stalling or that frustration that we face, but that can be a learning time.
Right.
It could be, and this is the thing when we talk about our faith with God is working in ways that we don't see. And that's what we as Christians have to keep in mind too, is that even if we're in the grind, if God wants that vision or that idea to happen, then we need to hold on to him, because he's working behind the scenes. He's doing things that are out of our control. When we think everything's dark or everything's bleak, he's on the move.
Right.
He's still working. He's God.
Right. And I mean, that's really important too, because I think, like on rainy days, like when you take a flight on a rainy day, is amazing, because you look, you're driving to the airport, everything's just dark, hazy, gloomy, and then you get on the plane and it goes above the clouds and the sun's always shining, right?
Yeah.
And that's such an amazing thing. Like with God, we go through the grind, but he's there the entire time, and so just kind of focusing on that. And also, you may have times where the grind may actually be a rut in your life, but looking back, maybe you being in that rut forced you to take a path that you never would have taken. And so, like, really, I strongly believe that with God, nothing is ever wasted, and we look back, and while in that moment it may seem unfair, it may seem boring, monotonous, but when we look back, I think with God's help, we truly see at least a fraction of how he has helped us navigate through those circumstances.
And I think that really looking at these, and was resistance one of this, or was that something that you added to that, or
resilience?
Resilience.
Yeah, so resilience was something that I added to it.
Yeah,
it was something that I brought up, and the note that I created or jotted down was when you choose to rename, reframe, and remain, we develop resiliency. And when we do it in one part of our life, we find that, naturally bleeding over into other portions of our lives, because we don't give up on things, because we know we are resilient, and it's like working a muscle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and I like the fact that you're saying that too, that sometimes we got to go through all these different words. Like, am I just needing to remain? Am I needing to reframe? Do I need to, what was the first one? To rename. I think that those are key words: to rename, reframe, and to remain. I think that those are keys to kind of work through as we go through those times of grind, to kind of say, maybe I need to take a different approach. I mean, that's basically what we're saying, right? Is look at it and say, maybe there's a time that I need to remain. Maybe there's a time I need to reframe, and maybe there's a time I need to rename it to really get a better mindset around it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I like the fact about the resilience too, because I think that going back to the perseverance and that builds character. That whole process there is important, because it really shapes us to be able to conquer, and it goes along with your statement about higher quality problems, that if I conquer this problem, that I can look out for other problems that I can solve, that's going to make it, as you get in a habit of doing these, solving problems for your organization or whatever you lead, that it's going to become easier. It doesn't mean it's going to be totally,
absolutely.
Not any hardships that you'll face. But there'll be times where you feel like, okay, I understand the process. I understand that I got to go through some of these things. And it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
God's got this, and I can work through that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, really, we recently, we're new parents, so, well, by a year. So, but it's really interesting because our son's going through, the walking phase. And I think so many times we forget that we were kids, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is he stumbles like over and over. Like he'll go for a run and he stumbles, trips, but he gets up. Like he's very resilient. And because of that, he builds his muscles and he's able to be a better, walker, as he becomes older. And so I think that's a big thing that we should just keep in mind is,
that's a very good point too, that's kind of there already.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how we let the world or expectations that we have dictate that reality, because really we are kind of built to be resilient in our world as a baby, as a child. And then sometimes we get too distracted with the noise of the world or even our own deep thoughts that we have that contradict what's really there,
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us. We have to continue to do this, and I've enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, Zach.
Hey, you're very much welcome.